Welcome. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Emily, and on behalf of the Seattle Public Library, I am so happy that you all could make it today. Um, Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're here on traditional unceded land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past, present, and future. I hope you'll join me in honoring with gratitude the land itself and those who have stewarded this land for generations. We also thank the Seattle Public Library Foundation and HistoryLink for their partnership and support of this event. I want to thank you all for coming out today. We're all here to hear and take part in conversation about how we understand Seattle's past and present through a multifaceted lens. Before we dive into intros, I want to highlight a couple of details about today's program. Assistive listening devices are available for this program. Please grab headphones at this table here. The panel discussion will run for around 45 minutes, and after this, there will be time for audience questions and discussion points. Please save your questions for this point in time. After the session, there will be select books for sale and for checkout at these tables here. Without further ado, I'm going to turn the mic over to the Seattle Times local history columnist, Jean Sherrard, to do the honors of introducing our speakers.
Thank you. Well, welcome to this panel discussion. I'm delighted to be here with these three remarkable authors. Before we begin, let me just, we all drove or bused here or trained here, and it reminded me that we're entering in that rainy season, which may last for the next 6 months. But what a wonderful time to grab one of these books and cuddle up in front of a warm fire and begin to read. And is there a better place than Seattle to love a book? It reminds me also of one of the great Seattle science fiction writers, Neal Stephenson, who wrote a book called Dreamdy, in which he described the one of the qualities of Seattle rain was that a windshield wiper could never find the correct setting. That as you're driving along, as we all did, many of us did today, trying to find the mist or the halfway to rain setting is always trouble. So welcome and thank you for coming on down. So each of these new books is, as you see on the screen behind us, is sort of an extraordinary narrative, and each is rooted in Seattle history, and I think that they can help us see our city anew. The works in triplicate remind me of Michael Heiser's sculpture Adjacent Against and Upon in Myrtle Edwards Park. And so three elemental forces in balance and tension, much like history and fiction, legacy. So let me just a quick introduction of each of our authors here. We have Jennifer Ott, whose work literally reshapes the landscape of our historical imagination. She's an environmental historian with a particular interest in Seattle's history of moving dirt, rerouting waterways, and leveling hills. She's also the executive director of HistoryLink, and she's the author of Where the City Meets the Sound, the History of Seattle's Waterfront, which was just published, and Olmsted in Seattle, Creating a Park System for a Modern City in 2019, and co-author of Waterway, the Story of Seattle's Locks and Ship Canal. So welcome, Jennifer, to this panel.
Thank you.
Just on the other side of Jennifer, we have Thomas Konstam, whose novel Supersonic captures a Seattle both familiar and startlingly new. He's a Seattle-born novelist who still lives in the same house he grew up in, now with his wife and two children. A graduate of Bowdoin College, Stanford University, and better yet, Roosevelt High School. He's worked as a freelance writer for more than 20 years, taking on roles as a Spanish and Portuguese translator, travel writer, and video and animation producer. He's covered everything from rainforest conservation to quantum computing to backcountry skiing. His books have been translated into multiple languages and optioned for film and television by Showtime and Vice. A Sundance Fellow for his work in animation, Supersonic is his third novel. Let's welcome Thomas.
Very much.
And at the end of our panel, we have Karen Trieger, whose latest book reclaims family and community histories often hiding in plain sight. She was born in Seattle and attended Mercer Island High School, Barnard College, and New York University Law School, where she served as editor-in-chief of the Law Review. She left her law practice in 2015 to write her first book, which chronicles her in-laws' survival during World War II. The book won the PNWA Nancy Pearl Book Award for Best Memoir and the Bronze Medal in World History from the Independent Publishers Association. Her new book, released in August 2025, explores her immigrant Jewish family's unique history and their contributions to Seattle business and Jewish communities, while inviting readers to reflect on the enduring importance of knowing one's family story. Karen has lived in Seattle's Seward Park neighborhood for 37 years, where she and her husband raised 4 children. Well, let's begin. A hand for Karen. So let's begin at the beginning. Let's go down the line, and if you can just tell us what inspired your project and what did you have to unearth, literally and figuratively, to accomplish it. Jen?
I will try not to cough. I'm not sick. I just ran from the light rail station, and I'm such a historian. I don't run very often. My interest in the waterfront actually goes all the way back to 2008, when, as an environmental historian, I'm always interested in how we shape the landscape. And I know in Seattle that if you're not in the Duwamish River Valley and you're on flat land, it's most likely that it's made land, human-made land. And the waterfront is a remarkable terrace, if you think about it. It's very flat, right there next to the downtown bluff. And so I was curious of how and why and all of that. And knowing that it's a seaport, I thought it was probably a seawall story. But man, I went down into the rabbit hole of the Seattle City Archives, which is amazing resource, and delved into the story of our seawall, which in true Seattle fashion took decades to finally stop arguing about and build. And I just was completely hooked on the history of the waterfront. It's just an amazing place. And so that's eventually what led me to getting the great opportunity to write this book.
Thomas?
So my last book prior to Supersonic was called Lake City, as in that Lake City, and that came out in 2019. And it was a story of a young man trying to find his way in the world, essentially. And in the writing of it, it became increasingly a book of place, and obviously ended up with the title of the book being a neighborhood in Seattle. And so I think growing out of that, I wanted to just do a much deeper dive on place, and I ended up writing this book about the intersecting lives of multiple families in a fictional neighborhood in an unnamed city that sure looks a lot like Seattle, in the 1890s, 1950s, 1970s, and 2010s. And just wanted to, I feel like a lot of people are moving here now, or have been moving here from all over the world, all over the country, all over the world. And not a lot of people have a good sense of the story of this place. They kind of know something that's happening now, or that, maybe there was popular music here in the 90s and we have coffee, and, just the kind of top line stereotypes. And I wanted to, in my own way, and being from here, create my own, or write my own sort of version of a creation myth of this place. So.
Thank you. The origin story of my book goes back to 2013, when my father, Erwin Trieger, died. And since his death, it really led me actually to write the first book as well, because he always wanted to write the family history, our family history, when he retired, but he never retired. And I said to myself that there's a project that I've been thinking about for 20 years, which is documenting my husband's parents' survival story through the Holocaust that I knew just needed to be in the world. And so I said, well, you never know when you're going to die, and this is my time. So I did that. Then when I finished that, COVID hit, and then I was like, okay, now it's my family's turn. And I sort of said to my dad, who is, dead. I don't know if anyone else talks to their dead relatives, but I do. And I'm like, Dad, let's do this project together, because he wanted to do the project. And so I kind of took my dad's hand and we did it together. I opened up the file. He had saved articles and speeches and pictures. He had saved so many things. And I just opened it up and I was like, what's in here? And then I just got completely sucked in. And I was like, who are these people that either I never knew, ancestors, or that came to Seattle starting in 1874, and or who are the ones that I knew, like my grandparents, for example, but I didn't know them in this way. And the story of Jewish immigration to the United States is fascinating. I knew about it as a general idea, but I didn't know it in the way that I now know it and that I'm telling it in the story. And Seattle's history, I realized it's right outside of my door. And all I had to do, not all, because it was really a lot, but it was really fun to just get off my butt and go to the places where all these things happened. And there's not much left. There's some left, but of what was there before physically. But the spirit of those early pioneers and those early Jewish immigrants who made Seattle into the city it is today, honestly, but certainly shaped the Jewish Seattle that we live in today, was really inspiring for me. And I came to a better understanding of like who I am. It became, of course, a deep dive into myself, as any book that we write, and became a much better understanding of who I am and why I am the way I am and my place in sort of the larger scope of history. And it was really, yeah, it was a dive into myself in the end, but it was really fun.
Thank you. Thomas, you said to us when we first met that you had been asked a number of times by readers, where is this neighborhood? But you have kept it intentionally vague and imprecise. Does that mean you're combining elements from a number of sources, or you're just obscuring it with a sort of a peach fuzz?
Good question. And yeah, at different events, I've had people guess at, it's got to be Beacon Hill. It's got to be Wedgwood. It's got to be, and it's not that I'm keeping it secret. It's that it's actually a fictional neighborhood. And yeah, it is a combination of different elements of things from around the city. But I wanted to combine into like a microcosm neighborhood that could represent different things of the city. And then but that takes me back to the bigger I guess question about like not naming Seattle as Seattle in the book, having a neighborhood that doesn't really exist. I felt that by writing about the city with just a degree of remove, I was able to talk about some of the more sort of spiritual themes of the city without being beholden to dates and place and not being in my if I wrote something that in the spring of 1971 for somebody to be like that should have that happened in November of 1971.
Right.
That's important, but for a different type of book. And I was one of the when I was writing it, I don't know if anybody here has seen the Royal Tenenbaums, but that was a movie that stuck in my head for whatever reason. How New York was represented in that film, it was like a bizarro spirit version of New York and not exact Manhattan. So
Right.
that allowed me to play with things a bit more, to kind of depart reality in certain ways, and also have an extra degree of fun while writing it. And I hope that this book is it's literary fiction, it's historical fiction to a degree, but I also like to think that it's comedic. Try to make it easy pill to swallow.
Jen, on the waterfront, would you categorize it as a historic neighborhood? Is that part of Seattle's? I was talking to Chinese historian activist Betty Lau, and she said her grandmother, I believe, grew up, lived in all three Chinatowns, the first of which was on the docks.
Mhm.
So do you see vestiges of this, of that original neighborhood or the neighborhoods that were on the waterfront in research?
That's interesting. I would say both ways. Is one is I chose the boundaries of King Street and Bay Street, which is the Olympic Sculpture Park, because that area has a cohesive story. There are lots of threads that go through that area, and as soon as you step outside those bounds, you get a much more disparate story where it's like, well, that only happened there, or that only happened there, and so I kept those boundaries on it. But now that the viaduct is gone, something is reemerging that has been true throughout, but was very much harder to see. But about probably 10 years ago, we did a series of oral history interviews that looked for stories from Pioneer Square and the Chinatown International District that would surface that long connection, excuse me, between those neighborhoods. And as we were talking to people, and these are all people that are, some of them are still working, it was not that long ago, that there was this interplay between all of those neighborhoods, and they were all very much connected to the waterfront. And so that was, if I could have written a longer book, I had to be disciplined. That's a whole nother era. I think a new book needs to be written that ties the three neighborhoods together. That I think that would really add some facets to the story and help people understand how they all come together.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that'll be interesting to read someday.
Somebody else.
Karen, you say 1874 your family arrived. Did they go to a specific neighborhood? Was there a place that it all was the kernel of sort of Jewish arrival, or was it scattered around the city?
In 1874, there were only 50 Jewish people that lived here. There were only 1,500 white settlers, not talking about the natives that lived here, those that came to settle this place. So it was very, very tiny. Talk about Seattle as a pioneer town. It was very much a pioneer town. And most people lived in the Pioneer Square area. That's where the houses were. Especially it wasn't that long ago. It was still in everyone's memory, like 15 years before, that there had been these major Indian wars where the natives came and attacked the people who were the white settlers who were living there. So people were kind of huddled in to this area. That's so sweet.
Bless your
Thank you.
heart. Thank you.
Everyone was kind of huddled in. But around that time, 1880, I would say, the neighborhoods started to expand and move out just a little bit. Remember, people are still on horses. Right? People are even the trolleys aren't built yet. So you had to walk up and down the hills. But Yesler's, Mr. and Mrs. Yesler, a beautiful house up on 10th and say Yesler, right up at the top of the hill there. And so that area, a whole bunch of people started to build, people who could afford it, build houses up there. And that became the posh neighborhood of
Right.
the time. It was called Yesler Hill. And my first ancestor that came, Paul Singerman, married, he came in 1874, and he married in like 1883 or something like that. And they built a house and lived on Yesler Hill. So that was like the posh area. And if there were however many Jews there were, they lived there. It was a very informal. There was no synagogue at that time. There was nothing formal about it. They gathered. There's historical records that they gathered for. They would rent like the Masonic lodge, things like that, for like a high holiday service. It was extremely informal. As more Jews populated Seattle, as the more people came in, it became more formal. And then also as more people moved up the hill, the people who could afford it left Yesler Hill and moved more to the Capitol Hill area. And the Jewish community of those first German Jews, that wave of German Jewish folks that came here, including 3 of my ancestors, almost all of them lived in the Capitol Hill area for two reasons. One is because that's where people were moving, but secondly, because very quickly by 1920, there's redlining in the city. And all the minorities, including the Jewish community, but blacks and natives, Asians, everybody, there was very specific places that they could or could not live. And Capitol Hill was one of the places that they could live if they could afford it. And then another Jewish community that was less wealthy, as the third wave of immigration came from Eastern Europe, they lived in the Central District. So I think that Paul Singerman saw the city go from 1,500 people to, when he died in 1915, to 280,000. He saw I'm trying to see the city through his eyes,
Right.
and he saw this tremendous change of a nothing to really a something. So yeah, the city expanded in various ways. That's fascinating to me.
Well, let's jump into that expansion because Seattle, as we see it today, seems to be perpetually under construction. There's cranes everywhere. Well, it's always, to some extent, been that way. We keep reinventing ourselves, and geographically, socially, spiritually, there's a constant process of reinvention. How does that reinvention of serve or threaten the city's identity in your work? How do you address this in your narratives? Yeah. Does it I know much of what you're writing about, Jen, is the reinvention of the waterfront and creating seawalls and addressing issues of deterioration and rot, and so yeah, go.
It's interesting. The driver of the waterfront's change over time is growth, that influx of people, particularly after the gold rush in 1897. But another interesting lever or propellant is technology and shipping technology. And when I was reading your book, The Supersonic, there's just such an interesting, it seems like a million years between a sailing ship and a supersonic jet. But really, it's just like the same process over and over again. And do you make the investment where you leap into what will serve that new technology? And then in some ways, you're going to have that ratchet effect where you can't really go back. And you see that on the waterfront, that we go from canoes and small vessels to then sailing ships and steamers and then steamships. And ferries go from fairly small to very large. And interesting is that it continues even to today. We have invested as a community, the Port District, into the Super Panamax berth at Terminal 5 on the west side of Harbor Island, across the waterway. And that was a really risky move. And it's the second time the port has made a pretty dramatic. Originally, the port invested in container ships at all. Excuse me. And so now I watch that berth and it's like, okay, let's see if it works, because there's some people that think that those ships are too large, that they surpass economy of scale and get into sort of behemoths that might be an albatross around our neck. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves.
Yeah, well, that's a very central theme in my novel. And I look quite a bit at how one community comes in or one family comes in and changes the names of things and tries to wash away, never fully washes away the history of what was there before, but tries to, layer themselves on top of it. But the title of the book, Supersonic, is about speed, and speed of change, and talk.
I thought it was about the basketball team.
Yeah, that's another sad story for a different conversation. But it's the central metaphor of the book is about the supersonic transport. And as I mentioned, there's a 1970s timeline, early 1970s timeline in here. And, Seattle at the peak, probably telling you something that some people in here are already familiar with, but uh, the supersonic transport was a Boeing project funded by the federal government, was going to change our human relationship with time and space. It was going to take, people were going to be flying to Tokyo to spend the night or have dinner. And we were going to have an American Concorde, and Seattle became the biggest company town in America around that. And in 1971, the government decided that it was a boondoggle, cut the funding, which essentially cratered the local economy for that. That led to the billboard, last person out of Seattle, turn out the lights. I'm paraphrasing it there. Um, but the engineering culture established around that arguably laid the groundwork for the rise of the tech industry. So that became the central metaphor of the book, this sort of reaching big for change, trying to do something, reach for something beyond our grasp, falling on your face, and then dusting yourself off and trying again, and maybe not getting what you'd originally wanted, but something that you needed. And I saw that as a good metaphor for Seattle, for different communities within Seattle. And I tried to thread that through with each of the major characters in the book. And there are a number of different characters, and they're all going through some version of reinvention and attempt at change. Again, doesn't always go how people planned, but just keep on moving forward in creative and often unpredictable ways.
Yeah. I think for through the lens of my book and the research that I did, there's two aspects of what I think about when I think about the word reinvention. One is how the Seattle Jewish community, since from the very early stages, reinvented itself and is still actually reinventing itself to try to meet the needs of the people who live here. It's very much, I think that the people who are actively involved in the Jewish community reinvent it all the time because we're trying to make it what we want it to be. And that's the beautiful thing about what you can do in a small community where there's lots of different opinions and different wide variety of ways to do things, and they're all okay as ways to do things within the Jewish world. And people who want nothing to do with sort of the religion of being Jewish, but feel themselves very tied to the Jewish community. And that's a big part of Seattle's Jewish community, honestly. And so Seattle's trying to reinvent itself about how we live together with the larger within the larger city, but also how we live together with each other. And it's a fascinating thing. But something very particular that really hit my mind with the idea of reinvention goes back to the historical story of the first wave of Jews to come to Seattle were young, primarily men, primarily from Germany. This is all over the United States, and from around 1820 to around 1880 is the period of time. And three of my ancestors came. I'm talking about young. They were 16, 17, 18 years old, left their families behind. Talk about reinventing themselves. They completely reinvented themselves to come to a new country, learn a new language, a new culture, and succeeded tremendously in this new world and in Seattle, which was certainly inventing itself in the early ages. But then what I really noticed was when that next wave of Jewish immigration came, which was 1880 to 1924, 2.5 million Jews from Eastern Europe. And it's a whole story of like what triggered all that. That's not for right now. But what was interesting to me already here in Seattle, most of them had become successful already, including my relatives. And they saw this new wave of Yiddish speaking, religiously observant Jews come into the city and who didn't know English, who didn't dress like everybody else. They were like, this is going to be bad for us. We have to help them because we have to help them, but we have to help them reinvent themselves quickly so that they can acculturate and assimilate into the Seattle community, the broad civic community, so that the Jews aren't looked down on by the rest of the community in a way that is bad for all of us. So it was an actual thing that they did. They created institutions and classes and organizations that helped these folks come into the city, get settled, which was great. But then they had the classes was to like, okay, I'll give you some examples. Hygiene, American citizenship, English, like how to for the women how to run your household in America. I mean, it was very different. My ancestors that came from little tiny Shtetl, a Jewish town in what's now Belarus, they had a small house with a wood stove, and that's what I mean. There was no amenities, you know what I mean. There was the bathroom was outside. It was like that. It was everywhere in those times. But um, so those early people came, they reinvented themselves, and then they were actively involved in helping these others to reinvent themselves as quickly as possible. And I think that is the story of Seattle. People who came here from the beginning and still come here today come here oftentimes to reinvent themselves or reinvent something that is of interest to them. We reinvented the whole waterfront. And so I think it's a story of Seattle that comes from the very, very early days and that is still with us today. And we're all trying to figure out which parts of that reinvention we want to ingest and put into our own life or which part we want to reject. And that's our right as citizens. So yeah.
Thank you.
I was just gonna say that that also just made me think about how Seattle didn't invent coffee, didn't invent the operating system, didn't invent the airplane, any of like it is.
But we did.
What's that?
Oh, but we did.
And yeah, we are a city of reinvention and of not being tied to the past in the same way as other places. Obviously, everything is tied to the past to a certain degree, but in our mentalities of like, you know, we're here on the edge of the known world. We can re-envision how things are done, and why not do it this way?
I think that's really very true. If you take just one moment in time, let's say the gold rush, our own Alaskan gold rush. There were other gold rushes. This one, 1897. Talk about reinvention. There were other ports that people could have left to go to Alaska and packed up their bags. But the people who lived in Seattle at that time, they just did this huge marketing campaign. Alaska, Seattle, the gateway to Alaska. And so hundreds of thousands of young men came here and to the benefit of my ancestors who had stores that outfitted them. But that was, I mean, talk about reinvention. We've done it over and over again. That was the first really big one.
I agree 100%. And there's most of the characters in my book are completely fictionalized, but character based on Erastus Brainerd, who was essentially a publicist in many ways, who
An editor of the PI for a number of years.
yeah, very interesting person, but who was involved with the sales job of Seattle as the one and only departure point. And I actually saw some. He was very up on new technology too. Like, we're going to use this newfangled, you know, telegram and played media games, almost like we see with people who are taking new directions with social media and YouTube and just thinking how to do things completely differently. Like, what's our angle here? So yeah, interesting.
What you said also, Thomas, reminds me that so much of what we claim as Seattle is the result of, I mean, to put it bluntly, piracy. We're kind of, there's a pirate culture as well. We just take what we want and then adapt it to the future. Well, so each of these narratives grapples with who belongs here and who doesn't belong here. I think, of course, the vast majority of us who are here now are immigrants. And I guess historian David Berge, in a wonderful phrase, I think, described the origins of Seattle as being tantamount to an original sin. Showed up, we deprived the people who lived here of their homes, and took over, and even refused to let them come into the city for a chunk of time. How has this how have these boundaries shifted over time, and how have you each found ways to address this in your?
Um, so in tracing the different families in my book, one of the families is Amish. And early on in the writing and research, I contacted Duwamish Tribal Services, and they actually put me in touch with David Berge. They said, and this was during COVID, so at first we didn't meet up in person, and then we started to meet at a cafe, kind of up in Northwest Seattle, and go through just detail after detail after detail. But I felt that it was important in telling this story about Seattle that there was a Duwamish family in there, and so that while they were deprived of their land, that they never fully went away too. It's not like they just disappeared. That's another assumption in this story. It's like something bad happened, or like we don't really talk about that, and then that was over, and then we moved on. So they're still there. They're just integrated, and you know, in the society. And what I was going to say one other thing about that, and I forgot. Yeah, it's a, a big part of the story, and essential part of Seattle's story. Oh, what I was going to say is that also I have seagulls in here too that I write about a lot, and a big rock, and those might seem like random things, but to me they came to represent this place before humans were here, because there was also this place before humans, and there's the natural world too. So it just keeps on changing. It didn't just come into being when people started walking. The changes are going to keep coming.
I think it's an interesting, and when you say the non-native settlers that were here kept the native people out, or you said they tried to keep the native people out, that I always try and point out to people that if people aren't familiar, it's in 1865, the Seattle City Council passed an ordinance that prohibited Indigenous people from living in the city unless they lived with and worked for a white person. And that's a horrifying law. And, it just tells you a lot about the times, but also I always point out that it was aspirational. There was no point at which Seattleites in that era could have excluded Native people. They relied on them for far too many things. And I was working on a sign we did in the waterfront wayfinding that's about this push-pull of people and the various expulsions we've had. And what we talked about with some of the advisory committee was that it's a repeating pattern. And then when you think about it in a larger context of introducing capitalism to a place, there are parallels with slavery in the Eastern United States. That in order to get that economic flywheel going, in order to get an economy started, there's been a pattern over and over again of one group of people gets exploited in order for that to happen and be successful. And so in Seattle, we have 4 waves of that, where people are, different groups of people need other groups of people in order to get the economy going. And that was true with the tribal folks here. They really provide a lot of labor and knowledge and just sort of workings of the city in those early years. And then you see the Chinese laborers that come over, and they also provide this essential laborers that we needed. I was just rereading David Williams this year. We worked on that Waterway book together when we're about to re-release it. So we've been rereading it and talking about how Chinese American laborers dug the first ship canal between Fremont and Salmon Bay, and or log canal. What have we decided to call it? It's the log canal. And it's likely possible that they also dug the first log canal between Lake Washington and Lake Union. And there weren't enough non-Chinese people here to do that much labor. And if you're talking about railroads and bridges and all the things that you need to build a city. And then once we, as a nation, passed the Chinese Exclusion Act and we have the Chinese expulsion in 1886, then you have another sort of dearth of laborers, and you see Japanese immigration pick up and bring in that community. And when we decide as a community that we're going to exclude Japanese people and restrict immigration, then we turn to Filipino nationals who are coming in because of the wars of 1898. And so over and over again, in order to keep this economy going and to have the laborers that we need, people that there's a push pull of needing the labor, but also wanting to push people out because a good number of the white community members see this as a white city and don't want it to be anything else. So it's an interesting back and forth, right?
I'm hearing
Literally
some
on the
echoes.
waterfront.
I'm hearing some echoes of history today.
Oh, yes,
yeah,
it's
maybe.
sadly it just keeps repeating that idea of rhyming, even if it doesn't
Mm.
repeat exactly.
Yeah, I would say I would agree with everything that's been said. From my perspective and the work I did on this book, I have to take a step back and just recognize that all of the ancestors that I highlight in this book left somewhere in Europe because of the persecution, and because some of them were thrown out, or some of them were thrown out in ways, um, not literally but figuratively thrown out, and left and came to the United States and then Seattle to find a better life. And there's irony, obviously, that they came here to find a better life and succeeded in finding that better life, but at the expense of other people who were living here and who had a harder time because of it. And but the sad thing that I see is just the returning of history over and over again. And you mentioned so many of the waves, and I mean, Jews sadly are, we have 2,000 years of being thrown out of places and persecuted by many kinds of people, and many people who came here from the 1820s, even until today, Jewish people believed that the United States was a haven where they could live and be free. And all of my grandparents said that all the time, that this was a place, even my father also, that this is a place that has been good for our families, good for Jewish people. Obviously anti-Semitism tends to rear its head periodically throughout time everywhere, and that's just, I don't think that's ever going to go away. But there's just an irony to the fact that these people who were persecuted and basically thrown out of where they were living came to places in the United States where other people were thrown out of where they were living. And it's just a sad irony about the way the world churns and churns and turns and turns, and it's kind of what both of you said.
There are many more questions, and this is a wonderful conversation. I'm enjoying it greatly. I think what we're going to do is we're eating into our question time. So why don't we have each of you? I think you've chosen a passage from your books. Maybe we could just do a short reading and then conclude and stop for questions.
I had quite a morning, and so I had to bring mine on my iPad because my stack of books is in my office. So I'll read from here. Let's see. This is from a chapter about the Transcontinental Railroad coming to Seattle. So I have, by the late 1860s, Seattle had a well-established maritime connection to San Francisco and a nascent trade relationship with Alaska and British Columbia. But it was still just one of numerous West Coast ports trying to dominate the Pacific Rim trade. The vast, sparsely populated area between the coastal towns and the Midwest and East Coast, and the absence of overland transportation, more effective and reliable than oxen-drawn wagons, stymied development of local industry. Instead of handling manufactured goods, the ports generally served as depots for the transfer of their region's natural resource wealth to places where the lumber, coal, fish, and furs were needed. Over the 1870s and 1880s, Seattleites eagerly pursued a railroad connection to the east that would launch it as a hub of regional, national, and global maritime trade. Civic leaders in Washington Territory's ports first looked at the Northern Pacific Railroad as their best hope. In 1869, The company renewed its efforts to build a railroad across the Great Plains and Rocky Mountains to a Pacific Northwest port that would provide a connection to Pacific Rim ports. Two parties set out from Minneapolis to review the route Isaac Stevens had identified in 1854. One party went to the Dakotas in eastern Montana, while the other, led by Thomas Canfield, traveled to Washington. The Canfield party included William G. Moorhead, a railroad investor, from J. Cook and Company, Northern Pacific engineers William Roberts and William Johnson, and Samuel Wilkeson, a writer of distinction employed by J. Cook and Company to describe the route of Northern Pacific Railroad. Upon reaching Puget Sound in July, the Canfield party assessed candidates for a western terminus. They had considered Portland, but the treacherous bar at the mouth of the Columbia River stood between its port and the ocean. Too many boats and lives had been lost to the unpredictable currents there, so they traveled on to Olympia and explored Puget Sound harbors for 3 days aboard the Wilson G. Hunt. The party was joined by Arthur Dunny, who helped found Seattle, and James Swan, and an influential resident of Port Townsend. Swan had been in Washington Territory since 1852 and was involved in admiralty law and development of maritime legislation, so he had some authority on shipping matters. Behind the scenes, Swan offered to prepare a report for Canfield on each of the harbors and their relative suitability of a terminus location. Canfield accepted the offer, and Swan investigated the deficiencies and merits of Olympia, Nisqually, Steilacoom, Tacoma, Seattle, Point Elliott, which is now Mukilteo, Holmes Harbor, and Penn Cove, both on Whidbey Island, Bellingham, Fidalgo and Guaymas Islands, Port Discovery on the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and Port Townsend. And he cataloged all the things. I'm going to hop ahead. And not surprisingly, Swan recommended Port Townsend. But Canfield took the report and drew his own conclusions, and he saw the benefits Seattle offered with its deep water and central location. But he also asked Swan to look further at Port Townsend, Whidbey Island, and Bellingham. He had already decided the railroad would follow the Columbia River through eastern Washington's territory to Portland, which was far more established and offered immediate business to the railroad. And so in June of 1872, the Northern Pacific asked Seattle and Tacoma to present offers to secure the terminus. And I'm going to jump ahead again. They offered enormous sums and lots of land. But then on July 14th, 1872, the Northern Pacific announced its choice of Tacoma for the terminus. Tacomans rejoiced, Seattleites gnashed their teeth in anger and frustration, and the decision had hinged on several factors. Tacoma had fewer established local interests, giving the Northern Pacific more freedom to shape the port to its advantage. It was also a more realistic option because the railroad's never-ending financing issues, congressional deadlines for opening the line, and the extra distance to Seattle from Portland. In the end, it might have been in the long-term best interest for Seattle to have lost the initial battle for the terminus. Had they given all their assets in their offer and virtual control of the harbor to the Northern Pacific, the city's fortunes would have been more tightly tied to the somewhat shaky railroad, and a limited space on Seattle's central waterfront would have only amplified the railroad's power. And you see that all the way through to today. We have our specific waterfront is more flexible and more successful because we've had more direct control of our waterfront. So kind of cool.
Super interesting. I just have a short prologue here. 1852. Seagulls circle as the pale bearded men return in larger boats, this time with elaborately dressed women and children and a variety of unfamiliar four-legged animals. The birds watch through their yellow eyes as the newcomers saw down trees and plow earth into the tide flats once rich with crabs, sea stars, and young salmon. Not the highest tides or the darkest storms could produce such change. The gulls learn to compete for food with fresh desperation. In time, they are relegated to scavenging refuse and carrion. Many birds retreat along the shoreline. One small colony of gulls follows families from the longhouses as they flee inland. They fly up to a wooded hilltop crowned with a large gray boulder. There they find mice, soft roots, and even some smaller birds to eat. The gulls sit atop the rock, biding their time until the newcomers go back to wherever they came from. Things return to the way they used to be. Regeneration of Seattleite ever since.
Thank you. I'm going to read just a part of is at the end of my book. I call it a letter to the future. Um, the work on this book has humbled me as I contemplate my ancestors and the long reach of time. I'm awakened to the realization that each of my ancestors visited the world only briefly, 50, 60, maybe 80 years. The time we are granted is but a blip. These thoughts, however, do not defeat me. I'm empowered to make the most of my time on the world stage. We should see our lives as fleeting and as a gift of time to explore what brings meaning to us. Stories from the past come together to make our present time. Stories we create today build the foundation for the future. Does it matter that people lived, loved, and laughed? I believe it does. It matters because each of us matters. We each must reckon with what path to take in life and what our priorities and values are. We are compelled by human instinct to make a difference, and make a difference we do. Even if we don't receive a Nobel Prize, we each impact the world through our labor, our families, our connections, our acts of kindness, our acts of generosity and compassion. The waves that emanate from each of us outward into the universe connect to all others and reverberate onward.
Well, thank you, all three of you, very much. That was wonderful and illustrative, and I think we have accomplished adjacent, upon, and against. And now we'll take some questions, perhaps, from the audience. Anything spring to mind? Okay, I'm going to do a bonus round then. If you, each of you, if you can name one location that, real or imagined, that anchors your narrative specifically. So specific location, waterfront. There we go.
I would say the Washington Street boat landing, the foot of Washington Street. It captures the challenges of scale. Are we going to have small vessels or large vessels? And that was sort of carved out as the niche for small vessels. But we've also reintroduced the beach there, which captures that history of this was a shoreline that had tidal zones and all of that diversity that comes with that. And so if you stand there and really take in the setting and understand the spatial relationships, you can really get a whole lot of the city's waterfront story out of that.
Now Molly Moons.
Yes, exactly. Now Molly Moons.
Well, as discussed before, I'm a bit vague on specific locations, but the book is all contained in a hilltop neighborhood, and there's this gray boulder that I just mentioned in the prologue, right in on the top. So all of the action over different generations happens in that same sort of claustrophobic area, and the different main families in the book there's Duwamish family, a Japanese American family, Scandinavian, and African American. I saw those as different threads through Seattle cultural history.
My place is First Avenue and Columbia, because that is where Paul Singerman had his 6th mercantile store. That was it was a palace. They called it in the Seattle Times a mercantile palace. It was 5 stories high. First store to have an elevator, electric lights, had a telephone. It was magnificent. And then it was burned to the ground by the Great Seattle Fire exactly a year later. Wow. And then in the same place, they were such good marketers. June 6th is when our big fire was. June 6th, 1889, and June 6th, 1990, at exactly 3:10 p.m., which is when the flames of the Seattle Fire hit Toklas and Singerman, which was the name of the store, on that terrible day. They had their grand opening at 3:10, June 6th, 1990. And sorry, thank you, 1890, of course, 1890. And it speaks to what happened to Seattle before the fire and after the fire, the resilience of the people who lived here, and the tenacity of my great grandfather, great great grandfather.
Oh, we have a question.
Yes, father. Toklas, Ferdinand Toklas was the business partner of my grandfather, great grandfather, Paul Singerman. He lived in San Francisco, and he was the father of Alice. And the reason that Alice lived in Seattle for some years, from the age of around the age of 13, was because after the fire, Toklas, Ferdinand, brought his whole family up here. And they were up here for a good 5 years, rebuilding the business. So Alice lived here for a good 5 years.
Are there any pictures of Alice in town?
In the book, not
In
in the book.
photographs? I mean, any
Oh yeah,
photographic record?
you can find them in the Seattle Times. There's articles about, yeah, and there's yes, you can find in the archive. I mean, I don't know where else you find them, but the Seattle Times and PI archives have articles about her.
I speak as an interested party. So
I see it now and then coming.
Oh, okay, there we go. Good question.
I can comment on this. I was a young actor in a what? Yes. So you were asking about a favorite location or in film or so how so particular films or books that seem to be successful and yeah. Cinderella Liberty is
I was
kind
going
of
to say the
wonderful.
same thing. You just stole my answer.
Sorry. You can tell you well, mine is very specific because as a kid, I went to work in a little theater which was once the empty space down in the market. It was called Stage One. And on the steps of Stage One, which is the corner of where Post Alley turns, Marsha Mason and James Caan shot a scene uh, right there, and I all the actors, young actors who were in the theater, were kind of hiding in the background while they shot this scene. So there's a particular sentimental favorite of the portrayal. And what about you, Thomas?
Well, I was a kid in the night, went to high school in the early 90s, and all the representations, aside from I guess in singles, and generally Seattle was like, this kind of aw shucks, very happy, like everything's great in this town. And when I first saw Cinderella Liberty, it showcased that sort of pirate side of Seattle
Right.
a little bit, and the grittiness that I had seen a bit more in my youth initially. And it just showed a different side of the town that was I think a little less represented in popular media. And yeah, it was from an earlier decade too, but
I would have to say singles, because that's just a sentimental favorite. I was in college when that came out, and I remember going to the theater. We went to Oak Tree, and everyone in the audience cheered when their neighborhood came up in any of the scenes. But what I also, right after that, I moved to Iowa to live for a year, and it I could tell people it's like, oh, that's actually the things I love about Seattle are in that movie, particularly because they don't get too precious about the grunge scene. They kind of make fun of it a little bit, which I was a fan, but Seattle does have a tendency to take itself too seriously. And so I loved that Singles poked a little jab of the elbow at it. And I thought that was a nice balance of this is this great place that I love, but also we're a little precious.
I don't know that it's a good depiction of Seattle particularly, but I did love Sleepless in Seattle, and now I like it even more because my niece lives on a houseboat in Lake Union, and I've been there a few times, and it's this whole world unto itself. That those people who live there, it's a whole different universe. So, I don't think it really had a great depiction of Seattle, but that slice, I think it did. It did its thing.
Here we go.
I'll repeat that. He's asking about the mass land moving and excavation that essentially builds the city here, and when did it get started, and what instigated it. Is that a good summary? And it's interesting. It starts. I'm nervous to answer this because David Williams is right there, and he wrote an amazing book called Too High and Too Steep. But it is also what drew me to the waterfront is this amazing land movement. And the simplest answer is that what instigated it is that if you're going to build a city and you need to have industry in order to make it a growing port concern, you have to have level land. And our hills are so steep, just straight up from the waterfront, except for that little bit of space that was at where Pioneer Square is now. And so, just from the very beginning, they first build out over trestles, pilings with planking and that sort of thing. And then eventually, as they have the wherewithal, both the capital and the labor, they start to build seawalls and they start to construct. And so the fire contributed to it in that they took a lot of the refuse from the fire and just pushed it over to the shoreline and started filling. But until they could build a seawall, the tides just took out most of the fill. And so south of Madison, after 1916, there is a seawall that gets built and eventually would stretch all the way to where Spokane Street is now at the mouth of the Duwamish, and they fill behind that with just an incredible variety of materials that come down from regrades and dredging and spoils from different things. And then, but they didn't build it north of Madison until 1934. It was built on trestles until then and just tormented by shipworms and wave action. And as vehicles get heavier because the motorized vehicles come in, they start to fall through. And it's just a nightmare to maintain. But it was super expensive to build north of Madison because the seafloor is steeper. And so the whole time that they were leveling Denny Hill, there's letters to the city engineer of why are you just dumping that fill into the bay? You could be putting it on the waterfront. And he responds to all of them. It's like, well, vote to pay for it if you want us to build a seawall. Otherwise, the fill on the central waterfront is from the mouth of the Cedar River in Lake Washington. They dredged it out from there. It's a gravelly mix. And then they brought it around through the ship canal to the waterfront and used that for the fill.
Yeah, so the question is about the balance between big business and creativity in Seattle, and I think that Seattle Seattle was, as Karen had talked about how much it changed during the gold rush. um wa- it was always a boom town, and boom and bust, and is also a very young American city. So I think by the time that it was settled, there were somewhat formal business interests already, at play. It wasn't people just winging it so much. There was a lot of organized purchase of land for purposes of development. And then so sorry, when the gold rush happened, then I think that just a lot of forces came into play of making big money and doing it in an organized fashion. It's an interesting juxtaposition or interplay that I don't really have a clear answer for, but it keeps perpetuating. And it's not just the big company. We have also, there's Costco, and there's the whole video game industry, and like Seattle's really, it's an interesting juggernaut because we're still a small city. Seattle proper doesn't have even 1 million people still. Like, when in world history has a second, third tier city size wise had that much out? I mean, San Francisco is a similar phenomenon. Amsterdam back in the day during the tulip boom. I don't know, and I don't know that. I mean, hopefully some other people can contribute on the answer there, because I don't know the answer, but yeah, it's a rare combination that's going.
You want to add?
No, I don't really. I didn't really do the research into the whole city. I'll just make one comment about the on the capitalist side. Um, Seattle was, what I learned through this research is that Seattle was home to a lot of different kinds of retail merchants. All of my ancestors were retail merchants, hats, jewelry, department stores. But there was also the side um, of the small mom and pop stores. There were some that became very large and very successful, but there was other family members that just opened up a small neighborhood store and were just the place that you stop by on the way home, and were integral and integrated into that neighborhood. My grandparents had a store in 23rd and Jackson, right on the corner, and it was the place you go on the way home just to pick something up, and that's how they made their living. And in contrast to, like, let's say, the Friedlanders, who had a large jewelry store down on Fifth and Pike, and that was like a very different vibe. And so Seattle was home to many different, and this is like, we're not talking about anything like, Boeing and Amazon, everything. This is a very smaller scale. But it's interesting because it's those smaller merchants and smaller business people and laborers that made up Seattle and made Seattle who it is, and the culture that we have here today with the Nordstrom service culture. It started before Nordstrom. It started with Paul Singerman and and others like him. And I think that push and pull was constant throughout Seattle's invention and reinvention. So yeah.
I think that's really true. And also, you see a thread on the waterfront where there may have been large interests like the Northern Pacific or the even Schwabacher brothers or these really bigger companies, Dunn and Ainsworth and Dunn. But you see periodically that individuals would push back on whatever they were planning, and labor unions are another big pushback on things that were planned for the waterfront. But then when you get into the 70s, you get the citizens advisory committees, which is still something that's really important to Seattle's sort of democratization of shaping our city. And it's the waterfront park started with a mayoral advisory committee, which was business interests primarily that were populating that committee. And the first plan that was put out was just rejected by the community. They hated it. And so they came up with a citizens advisory committee, and it was much more broadly based. And that's what shaped the original waterfront park to different degrees of success. That was a challenging park, but it's also true of the current waterfront, is that there are a lot of people that are able to support it with large donations, but also a lot of people were involved with it that just brought their energy and ideas. So we are good at counterbalancing those different forces. Does that answer? Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, so go for it, Jen.
She's asking like, why is there a dissonance between sort of our sense of the city and what we love about it, people who live here, and that sense maybe out in the wider world that we're pretty provincial, pretty small, pretty tucked away in the corner. And I think that it's partly that one thing I would say that influences that is that Seattle is part of the metropolitan area that's aggregated here on the west side of the Cascades along I-5. And then there's a very large gap of space before you get to another large urban area. And that's what's limited us as a port. We don't have a hinterland of potential customers like Los Angeles, Long Beach has. And so I think that that it, it never, like when you talk about getting a flywheel of capitalism going, there's always been a little bit of a limit on that because it has to make a pretty big leap to the next place that it goes to. Alaska is quite some ways away and it's not densely populated. And then Asia is a long ways away, and so that just softens the uh, or weakens the link a little bit. So that would be the one thing I would say, like from a port perspective, is that we're pretty isolated from a market perspective.
I would say, driving in here today, like some of those weather stereotypes are not wrong. Seattle is not for everyone. That's one of, some people don't want to live this far north, and that's why we're a relatively smaller city, and it's a easy choice to let's move to Los Angeles and live in 72 degrees year round. But I don't know that Seattleites have a funny relationship with Seattle too. I don't know that everybody in Seattle is walking around starry-eyed all the time, being like, "This is the best place on earth." We might feel that on some level, and especially if somebody from a different town says something bad about Seattle. But I think nobody likes to kick down Seattle like people who live here have a love-hate relationship with it at different points. But I'll get to Karen in 1 second here. But I just remember during some of the tumult over the last years, our friend Kristi Noem was on TV saying, this was before she was in her current role, "I wouldn't raise my daughter in Seattle." And I was like, "Oh, get the fuck out of here. We don't want you. That's fine."
Well, I'm on the "we don't want you" piece. I will say, well, I don't know who lived here like in the 80s, but there was an era where like people from California were selling their houses for a lot of money and then coming up here when Seattle was still you could still buy a house here, um, and coming up here and buying a house. And my dad, may his memory be blessed, used to be like, "Stop talking about Seattle. Just stop telling people it's a nice place to live. We don't want you." And I think there is that feeling as part of Seattleites that like it's kept secret because we've been trying to keep it secret and we don't want you. But of course, people come and we want you and we love all the newcomers. But I will say that in contrast to your statement, like just close your eyes for a minute and pretend it's not a rainy, dreary day. And it was a day from like last week when all the mountains were out and it was sparkling beautiful. And it's those days that every single time those days come, I'm like, I can't believe I live in this place. And we live through the dreary, we live through the rain, we wait, maybe not so patiently, but we wait for it, and then we are rewarded with what we have. And people say it rains so much here. I said, well, that's why it's green. That's why we like to live here. It's so beautiful because it rains all the time. And that's part of what it is to live here and just embrace all the positives and negatives, the darkness, and those white cap mountains that are going to pop up soon as the rain clears.
I want to second that notion, but, and I think also one other thing to mention is just that most national media is still produced in Los Angeles and New York, and Seattle's just a side story. And things have been changing, and the way that people consume media is different, and continue to tell our own story more and more. But it's just been a kind of a small novelty media, et cetera.
It's interesting, as a Seattleite, I always find that when I go away, I'm looking at the weather reports for Seattle and thinking, oh, I'm missing it. I'm missing that perfect day, that perfect week. Well, maybe not Mexico. But well, thank you all very much for coming, and thank our authors for being part of this panel. And I think if you want to continue the conversation, they'll be down here and behind their books if you'd like to maybe purchase a copy and get a signed edition. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you to our moderator, Jean. That was excellent. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you,
very
guys.
much. Great questions. Thanks to Emily and the library.
Yes.
That's right.
for hosting
Thank you,
us.
Seattle Public Library.
Good.